We're tickled to be here with you. We might kind of tell you where we are. We're together. Kirk's sitting in the living room, and I'm here in the sanctuary with Bob and with Bella, our elderly puggle. And we're in Wheeler, Oregon. That's a town about 451 people. And we've been here for a few months, and it's raining today. And it rains here a lot, and it's beautiful, truly beautiful. And we're just very happy to be able to kind of share our ideas about something that we've been thinking about for a long time. Kirk, you want to talk about just a little bit about the history of how we kind of got into, well, I guess it started back in the 80s, 90s, participating in some randomized controlled trials, trying to figure out how can we do a better job helping people with depression. And that really led us into developing curriculum. We're going to talk about that a little bit later today. And evaluating it, looking at it, how did it help? What kind of impact did it have on people's behavior? About the same time we were doing that kind of research, we were also working with Steve Hayes. And we worked in settings from the beginning that required us to be brief. And so our version of ACT has always been adapted for working briefly. And of course, back in the 80s, when we met Steve, there was no ACT, it was comprehensive distancing, and ACT developed later on, and in fact was branded to help people that are challenged by time, don't have much time, have trouble engaging people, keeping them in treatment so you can kind of roll out the treatment. So we're going to talk about these sorts of things, and I'm going to share my screen with you now and switch over to some slides. Kirk has his company. It's called Heart Matters Consulting, and I have my company, Mountain View Consulting. We both have websites with materials on them if you want to take a look at that. We're going to start today talking about prevalence and impact of depression because it's a really big problem, and it's becoming more prevalent now, and prevalent among the people who care for people that are depressed. Increasingly, we see healthcare workers experiencing significant symptoms of depression and anxiety. Maybe of the, I don't know, almost 1,000 people are registered for this webinar, this 2-hour webinar. Maybe as many as 200 or 300 at this very moment are experiencing some symptoms of low mood, low energy, low motivation that concerns you. So we hope that today is something you can use to enhance your own ability to stand up and do the very difficult job that you're doing at this time of challenge in our world. We're going to talk about all the different kind of factors that go into being brief, and we have a case example that we'll share with you, and that's when we're going to engage you and kind of thinking through kind of in today's world, in your community, kind of what would happen for this person suffering in this way, what services would be given, where, how would the person be responding to them. And then we're going to contrast that with a fact-informed or focused acceptance and commitment therapy informed response to this depressed woman. We learned yesterday, to really, again, to our delight, that this was a 2-hour webinar instead of a 1-hour webinar. So that gives us more time to kind of roll around on our topics. And Kirk is just so great in terms of kind of getting into some of the processes and methods. So he'll have a lot of time to talk about that. And we may still have time to do a little bit of role playing so that you can see how we can work in the moment to influence a person's skills for showing up to what life is delivering for them at this point in time. At the end, and John was mentioning this, we're going to just briefly introduce this idea of an ultra brief screen and intervention, because we really do need to think in terms of population-based response to the problem of depression, because the prevalence is so high. And we're going to preview a FACT course that we'll be delivering with Praxis starting in the fall. And maybe some of you will be interested in hearing more about that. Kirk, you want to say a few things about the Mindfulness and Acceptance Workbook for Depression, the first edition, the second edition? We both really enjoyed working on this, and our daughter, Joanna Mae Robinson, was a collaborator on both editions. She's an excellent editor, so I always like to acknowledge her work with us.
Yeah, we started the first workbook in 2008 was when it was published, and it was really an opportunity to think about what would we like to put in the hands of the average Joe or Josephine out there who was struggling with depression, very unlikely to see a therapist, maybe not even to mention it to a doctor or even a spouse. Because we know from the research that lots of people just labor with depression in silence. And I think the same is true with anxiety and trauma and other things that people carry around, is they're not always willing to ask for help. If they do ask for help, they're asking for it in situations or settings where it's going to be very, very rapid, whatever the response is. And, we're in to our surprise, I guess, turned out to be a best-selling book. And then we went into a second edition of the book, which kind of updated some of the newer developments in ACT, a little bit more process-focused concepts, but still very easy for people to get their arms around. And we've heard from a lot of therapists who treat depressed patients that this is a really excellent book to kind of organize treatment around, because a person can do a lot of work in between sessions if they don't have a lot of money for therapy, or they're out on the road a lot, or they're, just the way their lifestyle is set up, they don't have the ability to come in for regular meetings with the therapist. They can do the work in between sessions. And large parts of this book have actually been adapted to some internet-based therapy research in Finland that's basically shown you can do this via internet exposure, internet guided, internet assisted ACT. It works just about as good as, if not better than, therapist assisted ACT does. So there's a lot of need out there right now, because if you know the ACT model, we talk about these are common processes that are sort of socialized into all of us. And there's probably less than 1% of the people, at least in the United States and probably abroad, who haven't been put into a real zone of discomfort by the pandemic, in terms of having their jobs interrupted, their regular lifestyles interrupted, sort of being locked down, the anxiety of infection, disruptions in people's normal routines. And so it's, as Patti will explain, it should be no surprise, given that we are all sort of avoidance machines, that there's going to be a lot of mental health sequelae because people are going to do what they typically do, what they've been trained to do by society when they run into discomfort, and that is they're going to avoid it. So we'll sort of delve into that, more as we go along. But I think the message I would like to have people just carry along is when Patti said maybe 1 out of 3 or 1 out of 4 people on this webinar are going through the same thing, which is you've been brought out of your comfort zone into a zone of emotional discomfort, and kind of watching how your own responses may mirror those of the people that you're helping. Creates this more horizontal, compassionate stance, that I'm not so different than the people that I'm helping at this point.
So almost 7% of the United States population has had at least one episode of major depression. So depending on the setting where you're screening for depression, that prevalence goes way up. For example, in primary care, where Kirk and I work, it may be as many as 20-25% of the people in the waiting room are positive for symptoms of low motivation, low energy, and they're coming to the setting that's available for them. Real problem in this country is that most of the people with depression don't receive any treatment. They actually don't even seek treatment from a mental health provider. So about maybe 75-80% do not. Maybe 20-25% will see a mental health provider for depression. And equally likely is that they'll just go to their primary care doctor and ask for help. They may not say specifically depression, or they may say, I'm depressed, doc, I want you to help me with that. Now, the most common age group is 18 to 25, and the rate in that group is 10.9%, almost 11%. So our young people are really hurting, and it's hard to engage them and hard to make ourselves visible to them. So those of you that are out there that have some interest in social media, interest in marketing, we need your help engaging these people in learning about skills that can help them, because all too often it'll end up with pills taken to try to make something go away, tap it down, and that may, for some people, really do have the side effect of further numbing their emotions. And their emotions are so important in terms of starting to figure out what in their life needs to change so that they can live with more vitality. Another really important factor to consider is that depression is more prevalent in individuals belonging to 2 or more races. It's more like the percentage for our young people. So we have those vulnerable groups that we need to think about, and to think about what is their access and how would they find us and how would they respond to us, and how can we influence that. Kirk and I both already said the prevalence of depression during the pandemic among healthcare workers is increasing. Their jobs are unbelievably difficult, unrelenting, and it's not getting better for them. And so we need to be thinking about how to reach them in practical kinds of ways that can make a difference. The disease burden, the burden of depression, it's larger of any non-fatal disease in the world. So how can that be? Well, first, at age of onset is tends to be young. And we know that people that have depressed parents are more likely to develop depression. Sadly, we also know and have known for many years that we have treatments that would inoculate those children and start to break that cycle of parent to child transmission. So that's another area I hope someone will get concerned about. How do we get those treatments out so that they're available? How can we make it routine when we see someone, an adult who's depressed, we say, do you have children? And can I perhaps help, can you and I spend some time at some point working with your children to make them more resilient to depression? Depression's a common problem. And people say yes to this. I've done this, and they say yes to this. They love their children. They want help with their children. The high level of disability is due in part because of the high level of chronicity. What we really want to do is prevent an episode of major depression. We want to catch it when people are mild to moderate in symptoms, because once they experience an episode of depression, even when they are treated, they do not regain all of their functioning that they had previous to that episode of depression. It really changes so much in their life context that it's very hard to walk it back. So prevalence and impact. It's also hard to keep people engaged and resources. I mean, you think about it, the average person in your community who's depressed, maybe on your block or in your building, there's however many number of people. Where would they go? How would they know how to go? And what barriers to treatment would they experience? Would it be prohibitive cost-wise? Would they have to wait 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month, 2 months? And it's easy to understand why many do not receive care. We have not done a good job from a public health point of view of helping people connect and learn the skills that they need. The most common setting, again, is primary care. So if you're not working in primary care, think about it. Think about it. You can reach a lot of people there. And then it's hard to engage people. Really, what drives care seeking is psychosocial distress. And when psychosocial distress drops, people tend to drop out. It's just too much trouble. They have to get a babysitter. They have to take off work. They have to, whatever. If you're working telehealth, they have to get the kids out of the house or out of the room at least. So 40% of people drop out before the fourth visit. So let's talk for a moment about Margaret. We're going to give you a case example. So Margaret is a 32-year-old mother of 2 children, and she has children aged 4 and 6. The 3 of them are living with Margaret's boyfriend, and Margaret and her boyfriend are both receiving unemployment. They are going to lose unemployment soon. They're wanting to return to work. Margaret doesn't feel close with her boyfriend. They've been together 2 years, and she says he's drinking too much, and lockdown has been hard on them as a couple. He's critical of her. She feels safe, but just very disappointed. She used to like to be outdoors, but she doesn't go out much now. Margaret loves her children, and she does the basics for them. She says they're the most important people in her life and the best people she knows. She doesn't have much in the way of social support, kind of a distant relationship with living parents, and only occasional contact with her siblings. She's kind of drawn back from seeing her friends, doesn't tend to call them or relate to them on social media, is not exercising. She doesn't smoke or drink. She reports that she sleeps poorly and that she worries a lot, finances, just her future in general. She was in school earlier in the year and was starting a program to become a nurse. She was really optimistic about that. She was working part-time, and now she's doing neither. She really misses that. She describes her problem as no motivation, no energy. She feels like a shell of a person. She reports she was first treated for depression after the birth of her first child, and that she's taken antidepressants off and on for years, and she's never found them helpful. Current feelings of depression started 3 months ago. She has no suicidal ideation. So I would like you to think for a moment, what kind of treatment would Margaret be likely to receive in your community? Who would she receive it from? What kind of treatment would she receive? At what intensity level? And with what benefit? John?
All right, I have turned on the chat, folks. So if you want to answer some of those questions, you can look for the little cartoon voice bubble at the bottom of the screen if you mouse over things. And go ahead and let us know what you think about some of these questions here.
John will be summarizing and kind of sharing among the group as things come in.
Antidepressants is a common one that I'm already seeing here. Let's see, SSRIs, primary care. So some behavioral activation in there, scrolling by. IAPT services.
That person's from England.
We do have an international audience here today. Some more primary care, more behavioral activation. Yeah, primary care, SSRIs, those are probably the most common ones that I'm seeing coming in here. Do you want me to keep going, or is that a good enough sample?
No, I think that's good. And I think that's probably the case in many communities. And SSRIs are, they're still very, very popular in most countries. And why? Because it's quick and it feels caring. It's not because we have more and more evidence of their effectiveness. And I mean, we have Margaret here who says, they haven't helped me getting a treatment, given to her again. That's a problem. So
I do think
behavioral
it's interesting to note that before we move on that most of what people are saying share a couple of common threads. One is very few people even mentioned a mental health clinic. Some people did, but the majority said, you know, primary care. IAPT in the UK is actually located in primary care. So one feature is not in a traditional mental health setting where most of us were trained, and shares those characteristics of longer visits, more specialized care. The other thread is a lot of people mention behavioral activation, which is in fact a very, very brief intervention for depression. It actually works very, very fast. And so, you know, these two things are probably going hand in glove because it's showing up in a different kind of context, a community clinic, a school, a jail, or whatever. The resulting intervention is going to have to be sort of to the point and, you know, to work relatively fast.
So the behavioral activation, I think, is just awesome. I just wish that was the standard response. It's evidence-based, it's doable in a very brief interaction, and it's effective for most people. FACT adds on or builds upon behavioral activation. So I want to move now to talking about FACT and what FACT is. I'm not sure about your previous training experience with FACT, but the goal of FACT, I'll just start with very basic kind of orientation. The goal of FACT is not to get rid of symptoms of depression, as we might be trying to do with SSRIs, and we might be trying to do that really with behavioral activation. But the goal instead is to promote psychological flexibility and to try to promote psychological flexibility in every visit. And Kirk and I are going to explain what psychological flexibility is momentarily. In fact, what we're trying to do is look at how that process, that group of skills, is operating in that person's life, in their life context at this moment in time, and in that moment of clinical conversation that we're having with them. So what we do is we are listening to hear about their functioning. We're really concerned about their functioning, their ability to be the parent they want to be the partner they want to be. And we're concerned about the barriers related to being that person. So we want to know who matters and what matters to them. And we want to know kind of what rules they're following. I mean, because we all learn lots of rules all our life, rules about how to live, how to deal with suffering. And we're looking for avoidance because that's kind of the tension we see over and over again with depression is a pull between avoidance, trying to shut down uncomfortable thoughts and feelings, to tap them down, to get away from them, along with that emotional avoidance. I'm just not going to think about it, right? I'm not going to think about it. I'm not going to feel that. There's behavioral avoidance, right? What does behavioral avoidance look like? Binging on Netflix, drinking a six-pack, right? There's lots. The world is filled 16 hours on social media.
Sleeping for 14 hours a day.
Yeah.
Taking naps.
Yeah.
Hanging out in your bedroom.
Yeah. And so what we're trying to do is to help them tune in to what it is that they're avoiding, and tune in with an attitude of curiosity, interest, like you would maybe for a friend who is struggling. What's going on? What is this? What are your feelings? What kind of message are they trying to give you at this point in time? Kirk will talk more about the concept of workability, but workability is really looking closely at a person's efforts to cope with the difficulties they're having and how they work. Because they usually work a little bit in the short term. I mean, you drink a 6-pack, you feel pretty buzzed and you go to fall asleep, but it doesn't work in the long term. It's not connected at all with who they want to be. So it has side effects that they're maybe not aware of, and they're controlled by the short-term consequences. So workability is a big part of the conversation. We want to help them be able to come into the moment where there is the possibility to choose, to make a choice about their behavior, and for that choice to be based on their values, and for that behavior to reflect what matters and who matters. And then to go out there and do it in the world. We want to promote psychological flexibility, which is really just that ability to accept what's there, show up in the moment, and choose according to values and take action. It's a big group of skills. So FACT is great for the problem of depression because it is highly accessible for patients. We can do it in 15, 25-minute units. We can put ourselves in places like emergency departments and primary care, in inpatient units, all in jails, juvenile detention centers. We can put ourselves on the front line.
Churches,
nursing
homes.
Yes, absolutely, nursing homes.
Living facilities.
Yeah. And we, in our FACT visit, I just want to say we don't do kind of a general kind of assessment of a person. In fact, we take the problem as they describe it, and we do a functional assessment of that problem. So that really engages the person in a new perspective on the problem.
You might want to talk a little bit about what you mean by a functional assessment.
Yeah. So we really want to see this problem from a very behavioral point of view. So we use a method called the Contextual Interview. It includes a series of questions, most of them closed-ended kind of questions about their life context as it is right now, and the problem context as it is right now. We typically complete a functional assessment in 15, 20 minutes, sometimes a little shorter. And based on that, we have an idea about their psychological flexibility at this point in time, their resources, their skills, their needs for learning. And we reflect that back to them and see if they're engaged in our conceptualization from a FACT point of view. And we'll demonstrate this momentarily with Margaret, saying a lot of words now, but we'll put it to tools, and you'll kind of see how it works. And FACT is also family friendly. Kirk and I are both really, really committed to family treatment of problems. And so we use FACT with families. We use something called a family matrix to work with families. And so many of the factors that maintain or make a person vulnerable to repeat episodes of depression are in that family system. So changes are important. We need to address the family system. So I do want to talk just a little bit about FACT, mental health provider as a gatherer. This is from the context of working in primary care, but it fits equally well with other contexts. So to begin to think of yourself as a generalist, you don't have to be an expert in like bipolar or adolescent depression and with suicidal ideation. You can be a generalist. You can just see people with all kinds of depression, any kind of depression, mild to severe, any age, and do so much good in the world. Accessible. Think about how is your appointment template set up? Do you have same-day appointments for your patients? Being there when somebody is hurting and asks for help is tremendously engaging for that person. Think about it. Could you change the length of your appointment time and better create same-day appointments throughout the day? Accessibility is key to engagement. When we evaluate traditional, hour-long, hour-and-a-half-long appointments with appointments where we're seeing people more briefly and on a same-day basis about half the time, we get better engagement. People like a system where they can ask for help and get help when they need it. That's very different from setting up a series of appointments. And it's not true for everyone, but I'm talking about the averages, the big numbers. Team-based, we really have so much to gain in terms of our effectiveness if we can connect with the other healthcare providers that are serving that person that we see. So even if you're not per se a part of a team, start to think of yourself as a team. When you meet somebody, find out who their primary care provider is. Find out what they have recommended. Find out if you can talk to that person, share the results of your plan. So it's possible when that person sees the primary care provider, they're supported in a way that creates continuity for the patient and amplifies the support amplifies the efforts of the person to practice new skills. So it's kind of like create a playbook that connects, that provides the interconnection in the communities of these vulnerable patients. And educator, teach this forward. We're going to give you materials, teach any of this forward. Do a 30-minute kind of, pick out 2 or 3 slides, you'll have it. Teach it forward to other people in your community. And try to do anything you can to make these kinds of treatments just a routine part of good healthcare. Nothing special, no stigma, don't have to go off and be diagnosed. You just get help. So Margaret, in a fact-informed kind of community practice, Margaret would know to call her primary care clinic and request a same-day visit with a behavioral health provider. She would know that because it's out in the community. There are brochures that announce this. There are posters. There are online materials linking her with the person that can help. Margaret would receive a functional assessment that I was describing, like the contextual interview. And she would work with someone in a collaborative way to come up with a specific behavioral experiment. That's the goal of every FACT visit, is to create a behavioral experiment that is designed to connect with her values and improve the quality of her life. This would happen in a 30-minute visit, and her children would be welcome in that visit. So, Kirk, will you go a little more into depth about a FACT perspective on depression?
Yeah, I think it's worth stepping back a little bit and sort of saying, what do we mean by depression anyway? And I think there's been a lot of telemarketing and direct marketing to people about, depression, what it is, what it isn't. And I think it's important from a FACT perspective, ACT perspective, to basically say there may be genetic, biological, neurological components to depression, but looking at that level of causal analysis is something that's been going on for 40 years now. And there still isn't any convincing data that this operates as a causal variable in depression. So I think we can obviously say, since we're all biological, neurological organisms, that there must be some aspect to this that's reflected in, neurochemical realities, but that is not a particularly useful level of analysis when you're talking to somebody who's hurting like Margaret. A key thing in the model of depression for ACT is that depression is not something you have. You don't walk under the depression tree and get hit by a depression nut and suddenly you're walking around depressed. Depression is something that you're doing. Depression is an ongoing set of behaviors that are producing very predictable results. What kind of behavior is depression? Even the people in the biological camp, after years of drilling a dry well, are now starting to talk about depression as sort of an adaptive response. And you could sort of say, if we just took that a little bit further, what is that adaptation? What goes into that? Well, what goes into that is it's an avoidance behavior that functions to substitute numbness and loss of interest, anhedonia, for an active sense of emotional discomfort. So if you think about Margaret's situation, there's lots of reasons for her to be anxious. Everywhere she looks, things are changing. Her relationship is not going well. She's kind of had to retreat from schooling. If she was laying awake at night, thinking about her life direction, there would be lots of reasons to worry. And if the goal was not to worry, not to be anxious, not to be sad about the failing in her relationship, going numb inside would be a perfect solution. And I'm not suggesting, and we never have, that this is sort of something that people plot or they scheme. I wonder how I can get out of touch with my feelings. I think I'll just get depressed. But that the training we receive in emotional avoidance, emotional suppression, that is just part of our social fabric, is so omnipresent. It's so in our blood that we just naturally respond to these situations by using avoidance moves. So one thing that I often try to bring out in even a brief discussion with a depressed person, based upon the functional analysis, you could start to say there's plenty of reasons for you to feel sad, for you to feel lonely, you know, whatever the functional analysis reveals. And instead of when sadness shows up, when loneliness shows up, what do you do next? So we are actually going to change the discussion from how are we going to get rid of your depression to beginning to see depression as kind of a sign or a signal that something is misfiring and you don't really want to deal with it. And so you avoid it by shutting yourself down emotionally, and you also avoid it behaviorally. So you stay out of situations, maybe in your household, or maybe with your friends, or maybe with coworkers, where this material could be triggered. And if you just thought about depression as a functional avoidance syndrome, you would have your hands right on the dials with most people, because this is basically how it functions in the short run for people. So it helps them sort of manage complicated emotional times, complicated emotional relationship situations. These are all things that we've known about depression for years. You know, that many depressions are triggered by relationship issues, by loss issues, by complex feeling issues that leave people kind of stuck with feeling a way they don't want to feel. Another way that depression functions as a protective device is that when you use the word depression and you tell people you're depressed, they start to tell you that you don't have to function in some of the ways that you normally might have to function. So there's actually social reinforcement for this. So if you go and tell your boss you're too depressed to go to work, you get to go home. You can also use the fact that you're depressed in your own self-dialogue as an explanation, as a rationale for why you're not going to take on these problems in your life. And in fact, I was trained, and I know a lot of therapists were trained to tell depressed people not to make big life decisions or big relationship decisions while you're depressed. So, I mean, even therapists throw social support behind the idea that there's something about depression that is disabling in and of itself, and that's the problem we need to be focusing on, when in fact, the real culprit is that depression is screening these other more basic, threatening, fearful types of emotional realities that people are running into. So in our book, I think one of the seminal insights, the thing we heard back from people who were readers a lot, was the idea that depression is not a disorder. It's not something to get rid of. It's something to utilize. It's something to listen to. You should regard depression as a signal that there's something going on in your life that's so uncomfortable that you're avoiding it by this sort of numbing strategy. And the anhedonia, the loss of interest, the loss of energy, the things that people talk about in the phenomenology of depression, they don't talk about depression as a feeling. They talk about depression as the absence of feeling, of being empty inside, of sort of being non-responsive inside. And that's exactly what an emotional avoidance state feels like. So very often when you combine the functional assessment, which is going out in the areas of people's lives that matter to them, and start asking them what's happening in this area, how's it going in this area, what are your values as a spouse or a life partner or a parent, and when you think about what you're doing right now, are those behaviors sort of consistent with those values? That's when people start to come up into the moment and realize that the real thing that's going on here is I have these other issues. And, the depression has sort of screened me from having to make direct contact with those issues. And because I'm not making direct contact with the emotional discomfort, the emotional discomfort cannot motivate me to fix the problem, right? So now the depression is simply a signal that you're basically allowing your life to stay out of balance by numbing yourself to the emotional signals that are coming in that are natural, normal, healthy, although they're uncomfortable. So we've used this term psychological flexibility quite a bit already, and most of you who are familiar with that probably have run into the flexibility model, but I think it's worth looking at in a little more condensed way, what we talk about the pillars of flexibility. So pillar basically is sort of a organized way of dealing with a particular aspect of personal experience. So one pillar in psychological inflexibility, one pillar that gives people issues is kind of the present moment awareness, what we call the aware pillar. But the opposite of aware is to sort of be unaware, to be sort of checked out. And if you think about depressed people, often when they come in the room, the sense is the person is sort of not there. You know, you're hearing kind of the mind, you're hearing answers to questions, but the sense of sort of active participation in the moment is sort of conspicuously absent. And depressed people tend to live in the past, they tend to live in the future, probably proportionately more in the past. And they have sort of a narrative that goes along with their ongoing awareness that is sort of self-destructive, self-defeating. It sort of emphasizes, you know, passivity, withdrawal, helplessness. And so we call that checked out. So sometimes, you know, I'll ask somebody, are you checked in or checked out right now? And they'll say, what do you mean by that? I mean, so are you here in the room, or is it just the shell of you, or is it just your mind? I'd like to see if we could get all of you in the room right now, because when you're checked out, the protective function of checked out is that you don't make contact with emotions. You don't make contact with traumatic memories. You don't make contact with uncomfortable sensations in your body. So being checked out is actually a highly avoidant place to be. And it's also going to be really difficult to get somebody to make movement in even a brief visit if you can't get them in the room. Do you know what that is? A random, hey, there we go. Can you push the next, just to kind of see if we can get the next, yeah. So in the conventional act and fact model, you know, the pillar on the left is what we would call open, right? So the opposite of being open to experience, to being sort of non-reactive, is to be closed off to your own experience. And depressed people are notable about the unwillingness to sort of make contact with distressing private experiences. And as I mentioned, you know, that sense of numbness, sort of disinterest, loss of sense of involvement is part of being closed off from your own world. And the other problem is the over-identification with the contents of mind. So you're basically fused or over-identified with rules that tell you you'll feel better if you just stay in your room. You know, if I go and visit my friends, they'll clearly be able to see that I'm depressed, and, you know, they'll sort of feel sorry for me. I'll be a burden on them. So you just identify with everything that your mind gives you that encourages you to engage in these patterns of avoidance. So now we're checked out of our own immediate contact with our emotional experience, which is our monitoring system for how we're doing in the world. And now we're closed off. When feelings do percolate, when they do sort of come into awareness, we actually actively push them away. We over-identify with rules that encourage us to continue to avoid. And the third pillar on your right is what we call engaged. So there's open, aware, engaged. When people are flexible, they're open to their experiences, they're aware of what's going on in the moment, and they're engaged in their values, and their actions reflect that engagement. The opposite is being lost. Go back.
Go back. I thought you were going to psychological.
I'm trying to give them the Cliff Notes version. So very often when you talk to somebody who's depressed and you ask them about what matters and who matters to you in your life, what are the things that are important to you? What are the things that you would like to see happen, you know, as you move through your journey to the end of your journey? Kind of what would you like to stand for? People will look up and say, I don't know. So they've kind of fallen out of touch. One of the consequences of being checked out of the moment is that you also lose a contact with the things that give the moment vitality. And so the things that give the moment vitality is I'm in the moment to connect with what the moment has to offer to me, you know, which is to be a parent, to be a partner, to be a coworker, to be a creator, to be a learner, whatever process you want to tie yourself to if it isn't about being avoidant. And since people are lost and out of contact with their values when they're depressed, they tend to rely extensively on what we call autopilot behaviors. They're basically just going through the motions. They're kind of slogging through their life from day to day, kind of doing things just because they've been trained to do them. They've learned how to do them automatically. They do them without much sense of participation. They don't really produce vitality. And so when you hear people talk about melancholia, you know, what they're really saying is the things I used to do when I was aware and present that gave me joy, because I'm no longer aware or present when I do them, they have no emotional impact. They don't seem to produce the same level of vibrancy. And so automatic behavior is kind of a consequence of being psychologically absent, being sort of emotionally withdrawn. So almost anything that you see in the traditional definitions of depression from psychiatric nosology is much more accurately explained if you take the same symptoms and look at them from a functional, contextual, a functional reinforcement type of model. You can explain all these symptoms in highly functional terms for people, rather than just naming them as symptoms of, oh, you're depressed. It's sort of, so how do you think it functions to kind of just go through the motions automatically, where one day feels exactly like the last day? So, you know, what's in it for you when you live that way, you know, and sort of how does that feel when you kind of make contact with that? So we don't really have to rely on these being symptoms of an underlying disorder, because these behaviors are all organized sort of in the pursuit of, you know, following rules that encourage emotional and behavioral avoidance. Talking just a little bit more about psychological flexibility, one of the things I alluded to is these three pillars of flexibility, and that's the ability to be open, to be aware, to be engaged. And when people look at these diagrams, they often feel like, now, how am I going to do that in a brief visit with somebody, you know, because there are all these circles and everything. It's better to just think about flexibility as a native process that ebbs and flows throughout the conversation with the client. And this is sort of more the process-oriented model, and that is, it's not like you have to target openness or awareness or engagement, and then you have to do it in this sequence or that sequence, but that you're just simply observing how the person handles the conversation with you when you start talking about their life. And, you know, do you see moments when they're kind of starting to close off. Well, those might be moments to help them open up just within one or two sentences of exchange, just to kind of do some gentle encouragement to kind of come back to something that you noticed. Maybe they looked down or away. They even said, I don't really want to talk about this. You know, you can be respectful and at the same time sort of slow down, let there be some silence, let there be an opportunity for the person to kind of hover around maybe what they were pushing off of. So it isn't like every session has to involve every single process and that you have to kind of account for each one. It's just be aware, you know, that what makes people flexible and able to function in life in general, and in these COVID-19 times, this is really important because everybody is being put into the same situation of having to kind of be open to being pushed out of their comfort zone and the feelings that arise from that, to be aware of their own existence, of the present moment in situations that are actually new, because there's a natural flow in people's lifestyle and their daily routines, and that's been completely disrupted. And so a natural way to deal with that is just to start to go numb, to go on autopilot, to find ways to avoid the moment because you don't have the normal protections of your routine, kind of keeping your attention diverted away from what's going on inside, right? And so it's not an accident that all of the mental health issues are starting to show up, as well as the addictive behaviors, because when you're pushed back inside, you can't use those normal ways of structuring your life to keep your attention focused outward. When your attention gets focused inward, you now have to start dealing with more stuff. You have to start dealing with, you know, who you are inside when you are actually paying attention to who you are. And when your whole life has been spent trying not to do that, or being trained socially not to do that, then it's going to make it difficult. So think of the flexibility as this ability to just kind of move and roll with, you know, feelings as they show up, to get in the moment, when it pays dividends to be in the moment, to kind of focus on your values rather than on the need to avoid. And that's more like a general theme in the conversation rather than highly complicated interventions. This is why we talk about the ACT therapist. In fact, therapists kind of model all of these qualities, because if you model them and you look very comfortable and you're able to kind of flow between these pillars, then the client is going to feel more confidence that it's okay to kind of come out of their shell and to do what you're doing. So we're going to introduce you to a key way that we think about cases in the FACT model, and this is what we call the four-square analysis or four-quadrant analysis in the Act for Psychiatry book. And it basically just divides the world into, you know, four squares. One set of squares are private experiences, and the other set of squares are your actions in the world, situated in the world. And then there are actions or private experiences that are not workable. They don't work. They're actually harming you. They're leading to negative outcomes. And then there are actions or private experiences that promote a sense of vitality, purpose, and well-being. Those of you who have behavior analysis backgrounds will recognize this as a very fundamental, old guard way of conducting behavior analysis. You know, what are the observable behaviors that are working that we want to reinforce with positive reinforcers? What are the observable behaviors that aren't working that we either want to ignore or substitute more effective behaviors for? And in the area of thoughts and feelings and memories, what are the private experiences that are sort of promoting dysfunctional behaviors? And then what could we do to substitute private experiences that actually promote with more experimental behavior? The normal flow of a session or a visit or a conversation roughly goes from the top left square to the bottom left square to the bottom right square to the top right square. So if you were just thinking in terms of goals, when you've done your functional analysis and you've detected all kinds of examples of withdrawal, behavioral avoidance, distraction behaviors, your immediate thought as the person, the intervener, is I'd like to move this person's behaviors from being unworkable in the world to being more workable. So I'd like to get them to experiment with a different set of strategies. I'd like to get them to do something different when they leave our discussion today. And, you know, in essence, that's why, in fact, we say every session, even the first session, ends with this question: what are you willing to try differently in life contexts that matter to you? So that we're practicing something in the way of behavior variability. We're starting to do something different, because it's only by practicing different behaviors that we can discover more workable behaviors. Now, the person may not know, or they do know, but we want to develop their awareness and acceptance of the fact that doing new behaviors may put you at risk for unpleasant emotional experience, because the behaviors you've been engaging in are designed to keep you out of contact with those uncomfortable emotional experiences. We'll see how this might play out with Margot in just a second. If you go to the lower left box, this is where we start to uncover people's avoidance rules and the fact that their mental traffic, their mental dialogue is organized or in a way to promote avoidance behaviors. So there'll be sort of a superficial aspect to that, but there'll be a hidden and more fundamental aspect to that. So the superficial aspect is I'll feel better if I don't go and visit my friends because I'm just so worn out. I just need to rest. That's the superficial aspect, because there's a truth value to that that can be tested. Did you actually feel better when you didn't go to be with your friends? And did you actually feel more rested or not? I know that's what your mind told you would happen. Is that actually what happened? And so in the superficial world, we're actually making the person draw a connection between what their mind told them to do. They executed what their mind told them to do. Now, did you get the result your mind told you you were going to get? And that's the essence of workability in the ACT model. We know your mind promised you this result if you engaged in this behavior. The central question is, if when you engaged in this behavior, did you actually get that result? Or did you get some other result that you didn't want? And most of the time, when people follow avoidance instructions, they get a result they didn't expect and they didn't want, but they don't stop following their mind's advice, because we're built, reinforced, and socially trained to do what our mind tells us to do 98% of the time. So it's actually pretty unusual in human experience to disobey your mind. It isn't unheard of, and there are times when you have to disobey your mind or you're going to get in big trouble. But normally, your mind tells you to do something, you do it, you get a socially approved of result, and you move on to the next thing your mind tells you to do. And in fact, if we didn't have this capacity to simply follow the automatic instructions, the imprinted instructions of our social training, it would be very difficult for us to have an organized society. There's a definite social advantage to putting people on autopilot because it reduces variability. It makes people much more similar than they are different in their behavior patterns. And it allows societies to create these complex interlacing patterns of social connections that prove beneficial for society. But when it's overdone and it's applied to the individual indiscriminately, when we just keep doing it and doing it and doing it, it becomes incredibly destructive because we never stop doing things that don't work. So part of what Patti was talking about in the functional assessment is we have to get people woken up to the connection between what their mind is telling them to do. And then when they do what their mind tells them to do, how did that work? Did that help? Did it hurt? And a lot of times when people are in the fog of depression, they are absolutely out of touch with the actual results of their behavior because they're numbed out. How do you know what the results of your behavior are? You get emotional signals about whether that was a good result or a bad result. And if your system is numbed out, you don't get the signal. So you basically become unaware of the connection between your behavior and how you're feeling. So in this model of the 4 square, we are going to move people over to the right-hand quadrant so that their rules are more closely tracking what the actual result is, and the rules actually track what their values are rather than what they were socially trained to do. And then we want to engage in behavioral variability. So the way people learn, the way all organisms learn, is by varying what they're doing. And it's only through variation that you can find more adaptive responses, right? And so the job of the discussion, what we're really trying to do is I want this person to leave here, our discussion today, however long, however many minutes it is, and I want them to be willing to try a different strategy in a situation where they've been trying the same strategy over and over again. And that's why it's an experiment, because we don't actually know what will happen when you try this new strategy. All we know is that good things tend to happen for people who vary their strategies. And so if we can get into a model where we keep varying and changing and experimenting, then you're not going to get trapped in these sequences where you're doing the same unworkable thing over and over again, just because you were socially trained to do it.
So I'll talk a little bit now about the 4 square with Margaret. So remember our case. So we're going to take one of the tools that Kirk was just talking about from a conceptual framework and map it to our case. So starting with actions, part of what we learned in the contextual interview with Margaret is that she's spending about 8 hours per day screen time. That's with having 2 young children. So that's a lot of screen time. She also tends to watch 2 to 3 movies per day with her young children. And during this time period, we always ask in our contextual interview about a person's life. We organize it into love, work, play, health. So we always ask about health behaviors. How are you eating? Eating okay? Sleeping okay? Using drugs, alcohol, social media, concerns about that. So we learned that during the screen time, there's a lot of eating of snacks, popcorn, ice cream, and weight gain. So in terms of thoughts, emotions, sensations, what we kind of learned about Margaret as we talked with her, listened to her, tried to step into her shoes, is thinking that she was a failure and that she would never have a good job. Kind of an underlying theme of I'm not smart enough, not good enough. And also, it's not fair. She kind of went into talking about that this is the second economic collapse in her adulthood. She's not getting a fair chance. at succeeding at work. So this could function to kind of energize her, but the way it kind of looks is to function to have her withdraw more. That hurts. I don't want to feel that. And not move in the direction of change. And then I'm not attractive to too pudgy, were her words. And we also had a chance to, as we kind of moved into intervening to clarify some of her values. And when she talked about her children, you could tell there was some connection with her values. It was a real thing. In fact, we talk about valuing. We talk about values really as action kind of behaviors. So they're powerful. So we want to get the person connected in the moment with what matters, who mattered. So we talked with Margaret about her children and when she feels like she's being the moment she wants to be, and the qualities that are there in the experiences she feels inside her body. She also said that family was the most important thing to her in the world. That, all said and done, she'd rather have done everything she could for her family than to have been a very successful career person. So that's really on top for her, and it's a huge source of energy for change. But there's also that I want to help others, and that theme going back. I've always wanted to help others. And also, there is some self-efficacy that we hear as we call it out in the interview. And she says, yes, I have. I've worked full-time and gone to school, even with 2 kids. So we know she has some strengths that we can build upon, and we call them out in fact. Fact is a very strength-based approach. So in that top right square, where we're going for behaviors, actions in the world that will support her moving towards flourishing, support approach behaviors, things consistent with what matters and who matters. These are the things that we put in and called out to her. They said, the thing about you is you keep trying. You came back to the doctor and asked for help. And, you do take the kids outside 2 to 3 times a day. That's awesome. You're getting yourself organized to do that. Get them motivated to leave the TV. And she was making meals for her family, at least one good meal a day. And she had a sister that she did call once a week. So we see those resources, and then we move into designing a behavioral experiment, careful to explain that it is an experiment. There's no way to fail. And that's really important with depressed people because they're predicting failure. And we even talk in terms of scientists, people working on vaccines right now, how many times do they fail in their experiments? They fail most of the time. Is it necessary? Yes. But the important thing about failure is to fail mindfully, to show up in the experiment, see what happens inside you, what happens around you, and learn from that failure, because that can inform the next experiment. So I always spend a lot of time really helping people understand the importance of intention and awareness at the moment of implementing a behavioral experiment. So this is the Bullseye Plan. We use this a lot. It's wonderful in team-based care. What we say in the Bullseye is the target is kind of the bullseye. That's the being the person they want to be, kind of demonstrating the values that are most dear to their heart. And what we have around that is the target. And all we want to do is get on target in our life. None of us are living the bullseye, but it helps direct our focus, our attention, our intention, our choices in the moment. So the value is to be a playful mother and playful lover. These were some of the things, these were Margaret's words. There's a part of her that she said is pretty funny. She said, it's the other side of my, really long-standing struggle with pretty dark kind of outlook on people. So her plan, a SMART plan, specific, measurable, attainable, related to values, timely. One, to make up outdoor game with her family every day, to go outdoors. And she had mentioned, one of her children always wanted to change the rules and combine games and do silly stuff. So they're going to make up an outdoor game with her family, invite her boyfriend, and then to do silly dances with her family 2 times, have silly dance break during every movie they watch together. And her hypothesis was that these 2 actions would move her closer to the target of her values. And that's what follow-up will be about. When she calls back or when we call her to check in a few days, hey, what happened? Or how are you feeling? Same, better, worse. We always ask that, in fact. And then we try to find out why same, why better, why worse, and how did it go with the plan? Okay, do part of it, do some of it, do none of it. What happened? At that moment of choice, did you think about it? And what were the barriers? This is where we get to target processes of psychological flexibility and teach skills, because we identify kind of what got in the way from a psychological flexibility point of view. We normalize it and we teach skills around that. You can take this approach in a group. You can take it individually, works very well in telehealth. If you want to see an example of Bullseye, a contextual interview, and a Bullseye plan, you can go to the website for my new book. And it's called Basics of Behavior Change in Primary Care.com. It's just all of that, Basics of Behavior Change in Primary Care.com. And there's videos on there as well as free materials. So take a look. I just want to share that with you.
I thought I would like to just talk for a second about the bullseye again.
Sure.
So this is a good example of using behaviors that might change more than just the person's behavior, right? If you sort of think about what are we asking Margot to do, we're doing these specific things. Those are going to interrupt sequences of behaviors that her family are probably all engaged in that kind of promote loss of contact with the moment. But for Margaret to do this, Margaret has to remember during the movie that they have to get up and do a dance. So this is going to keep Margaret from going to sleep sort of psychologically and numbing out throughout the movie. She has to kind of keep control of her attention enough to remember to do the funny dances, the silly dances, right? So it isn't just the effect doing silly dances is going to have on her kids and her boyfriend, but it also is requiring her to alter her attention. The way that she's been managing her attention has been to numb out, disappear, and probably just go through a movie without even realizing what's in it almost.
And what she actually did was agree to use a timer. She uses a timer a lot with her children to to
So
get
we're actually,
what
we're waking Margot up out of her slumber by having her do this kind of exercise, and doing something silly or going outside and making up a game with a person who's kind of preoccupied with self-narratives about failing and being kind of a loser is, you know, she's going to probably come into contact with whether the games were good enough or not, right? Is she succeeding or not? So we're actually kind of asking her, even if your mind kind of comes up and starts to be a critic about the quality of the games that you invent, we want you to do it anyway, right? So this is just an example of how even a simple behavioral assignment of variability actually will begin to tap into the other processes of psychological flexibility. You don't have to think about each one individually. You can just basically set things up so that this one behavior is going to kind of touch all three of these things.
Yeah, so now we're going to shift to kind of something that is, I think, very, very doable. You could go away and just kind of use this right away. And it's, you know, how to help many people with just a little of your time, and that's to promote behavioral variability in what people are doing. So this is based on a study published in March 2020 issue of Family Systems in Health. And it's a post hoc analysis of data from a randomized controlled trial looking at the effect of integrated behavioral health services on patient behavior change, patient and primary care provider satisfaction, and primary care provider support of BHC or behavioral health consultant interventions after brief BHC involvement. All of these patients were depressed, about half more in the category of major depression, half kind of sub-major depression. And what we looked at is what would happen if we offered these people a choice of these skills to learn. We screened them, looked at them, and we said, what skills do you use? Do you know how to use? How often are you using them? What would you like to use? And then we looked at their rates of use over time. So if we have really brief visits with people, does it change how they behave? So the measure we used, and it's something you can use in clinical practice, is called the Coping Strategy Use Scale, the CSUS. And what it does is it measures the frequency of use based on a Likert type scale rate ranging from 0, not used, don't know, to 4, daily. And you come up with the total score. It's the sum of item scores associated with responses to the following question. You can say over X number of weeks, the past 2 weeks, if you saw the person. If it's the first time you saw the person, just say the past 2 weeks. And then keep it consistent when you call again or ask again. And then the following graph shows patient scores on coping strategy use scale. So these green lines are the lines of people that got those brief interventions, the depressed patients that got the brief interventions. And they got them all like right away. And many people that came one time, 91% came at least 4 times. That's huge engagement. So it tells you that people like these practical kinds of skill-based approaches. So what you have, the lower green line is the ones with the higher severity symptoms of depression. The higher green line is the graph of the people with lower severity. So you can see at baseline, at pre-treatment, there's a big difference in use of skills between people with major depression and people with more minor mild to moderate depression. That's why it's so important. If we can catch those people, we can prevent episodes of major depression. And we certainly want to do that because of the data on what that does to a person's functioning and how hard it is to climb out of that. The other thing you see on this, on these lines is you see the black lines, and that's usual care. So what is usual care in this study? Well, these were people that were receiving care from their primary care providers. They could receive antidepressants. They could receive support, coaching on behavior change. They could receive behavioral activation, and they could be referred to secondary mental health or specialty mental health service in there. They could see psychiatrists for medication consults. They could receive state-of-the-art interventions individually or in groups. So it was a pretty rich comparison control group. So here's a new idea. Screen for skills, not pills. And use this CSUS and have a person just simply choose one or more areas that are low for them that they would like to increase. Set up a behavioral experiment around that. And in your follow-up, whether it's by phone or in person, check on their behavioral experiment. How did they do? Did they increase it? What got in the way sometimes? And you're back to psychological flexibility and working those fact pillars. So we'll send, I'm like really happy because the American Psychological Association decided to promote this article. In the series, they have a spotlight series, and it's like a wonderful thing because they talk about science, behavioral science, broadly to multiple disciplines, and not only in healthcare. So it's really a chance to get behavioral science out there where it's better connected with our efforts, whatever our disciplines, to make our communities stronger. So it's really, with fact, it's about moving people from I feel nothing, life is terrible, to I'm very connected. You can tell the puppy there, it's very connected. Kirk and I want to spend a few minutes talking about our newest books. Basic of Behavior Change is a book I wrote to promote interprofessional collaboration to support behavior change to people in whatever kind of healthcare setting. It is a book about fact, and it's also about working in teams, creating healthy teams. It's a short book, 5 chapters. You can buy the chapters individually, or you can buy the book. You can buy it as a Apple book, an ebook, Kindle book. It's very flexible, the ways that you can get it. On the website, you get a lot of free downloads. There's several videos. You learn a lot just by watching those videos and looking at the materials. I also offer brief trainings for groups that are targeted to different chapters in the book based upon the interest of people. And Kirk, I'm very proud of Kirk's new book.
This is just a book on acceptance and commitment therapy written specifically for psychiatric clinicians, sort of clinicians who are still using the diagnostic framework and are prescribers. So we actually are very proud of the work. I was involved with 5 psychiatrists from 4 different countries. And that was a little bit like herding cats. But interesting, you know, that everybody was able to come to sort of a consensus about how to talk about the role of medication, treatment, the how to blend the functional contextual approach with the latent disease model that underpins the DSM system and is the dominant model in psychiatry, that there's a way that we can create a rapprochement, a meeting of those two models that might actually be beneficial for patients. And I think that's going to be a very interesting new event in the psychiatric community. The editor-in-chief of American Psychiatric Publishing actually called the book a gift to psychiatry. So that's pretty high praise. Also have another book out on suicidal patients. Throughout my career, I've actually been a clinical suicidologist in addition to involved with ACT, and I've blended ACT principles into a comprehensive manual that really takes a very different look at suicidality, rather than seeing suicidality as a sign of mental illness. As you might not be surprised to hear, we're going to talk about suicidality as an emotional avoidance move and how to change the conversation with suicidal patients so that we're talking about the function of suicidal behavior rather than the sweating about the form or trying to get people to not hurt themselves. We simply start to reframe the conversation.
So these are some other resources for you. Kirk has another book that this was out 2019, Kirk, on assessment and treatment of suicidal patients.
We just talked about it.
Oh, okay. And Real Behavior Change, those of you that work in primary care, whether you're a nurse, physician, or behavioral health provider, I would say emergency rooms, hospitals too. This is a book that on fact provides examples of using fact with a lot of different patients, different clinical presentations, including depression, trauma, childhood behavior problems. And the bullseye is demonstrated repeatedly in this book. Also in this book, about a third of this book, and Kirk and I wrote this book with a physician colleague, Dr. Deborah Gould, who just was a huge asset in helping us translate these concepts so that they were more transparent and clear. But about a third of the book is about using fact to create resilience in healthcare teams and for members of healthcare teams, for healthcare workers. So if you're concerned about the stress level in your job, that might be something to look at. And there are materials online that are free, so don't necessarily need to buy the book to learn some of the things it has to offer. You want to say anything about brief interventions, or Yep.
Well, I think the Brief Interventions book is sort of the book where we really rolled up the whole FACT model into one package, and it's by far probably the most popular book on FACT proper. So if you haven't read much about FACT, that would be a really good book to purchase because it kind of lays out the whole model, many of the things we've talked about today, and some of the things that we haven't talked about. Another set of books, again, using FACT in order to produce powerful interventions inside this moment. It's actually how to use the present moment, how to use that a center pillar that we talked about, the aware pillar. This book really focuses pretty much exclusively on how to use awareness and to interventions with awareness and present moment processing to create radical change. So it's a very fun book to read because it's full of case transcripts, and every other line or so is annotated, so you can kind of see what the thinking of the therapist is as we go through clinical dialogues. And then there's ways to use present moment awareness with depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress, alcohol, drug abuse, the kind of things we see in clinical practice. In This Moment is actually a self-help book that we published focusing on kind of the similar theme of just developing a mindful, intentional way of responding to life stress and to kind of work in little tidbits on a daily basis to promote your mindfulness muscle. Just like we promote exercise by exercising, but we promote physical fitness by exercising, you promote mental fitness by exercising your mindfulness muscle. And you don't have to do it for hours on end, just like you can't exercise for hours on end, but you do have to have some kind of a pattern in your life where you bring that into your awareness. So the book kind of helps people develop a lifestyle where they can actually do that. And we've talked about, go ahead.
Yeah, we talked about the other book already. Mindful of Time, just wanted to say the fact master course is coming in the fall. Praxis will be announcing details about that. But some of the things you'll be able to learn are like how to dance with the pillars of psychological flexibility. We'll take you through application of fact to many problems, many different psychological problems, as well as medical problems, and working with the people that have both psychological and medical problems. We'll work on metaphors and metaphor development. Some of the metaphors we plan to cover are Marcia Sassano's Web of Life, David Bauman's Going to the Movies, lots of things that are, I think, fun and powerful. And Kirk and I really look forward to working with you on that. We're kind of like right at the end of our time. If there's one question, I think we can answer it. If you want to chat, John, you can open it.
Yeah, so the chat is on now. If folks want to type something in, we'll try to keep up. Last time it was quite a lot of text, but if you do have any quick questions, now would be the time. We'll give folks a minute or two to type in there. Is the fact course online? No, that's coming in the fall. Mm-hmm. I don't have an exact date for you yet, but yes.
I think Praxis will send out an announcement.
Yeah, there will be. We'll email everyone when we have actual release dates for that, but that'll be coming later this year.
Okay. Somebody asked about the availability of the CSUS. Was that going to be distributed?
Oh, is it? Yeah, you had the handout that you wanted to send along about a week from now. Is that what I'm thinking of, or is that something else? Skills
use scale.
I've got a couple of questions I can answer right away, real quickly.
They were asking about where can they get the coping skills use scale.
Yes, John is going to send out immediately following the webinar a copy of it, along with the citation and the basic findings. So you can talk about the science with the people that you use it with, and it is available to the public. There's no copyright, so use it.
So it'll actually be added to the course downloadable page, because that's much easier than sending out 1,000 emails. But yes, well, it'll be added there. It's not there yet. It'll be there probably in the next 10 or 15 minutes underneath the presentation slides. So you can download it from there. And the slides are now updated. We had like there was one or two that were last minute updates. The correct ones are now there.
Okay. And then in terms of how to evaluate fact interventions, so we have rating scales that we use in every visit. And those are on that website, Basics of Behavior Change in primarycare.com. So you can get them there. There's also the AAQ2 That's the acceptance and action questionnaire too. It is a measure of experiential avoidance and has been used in many, many, many studies on acceptance and commitment therapy. That scale is also a free download on the Basics of Behavior Change in PrimaryCare.com website. So those rating scale questions and the AAQ2, there's a relationship between psychological flexibility and flourishing. There's also a scale for flourishing on that website. So you might take a look at that too. I think it's a great measure for positive mental health and more engaging for patients than the PHQ-2 or PHQ-9, for example.
Okay, well, I think that's just about all of our time. I want to say first and foremost, thank you, Kirk and Patti, for doing this presentation with us. We're just delighted that you were able to do this for us today and for everyone here.
Take care, everyone.
Thanks so much.